Welcome to the Miscarriage Hope Desk Podcast, where we help women struggling with recurrent pregnancy loss by sharing stories of hope and interviews with experts in the field of fertility and miscarriage. If you want to download our free lab checklist, go to miscarriagehopedesk.com/labs. Again, you will go to miscarriagehopedesk.com/LABS to download your free checklist. If you want to connect with others going through recurrent miscarriage, please check out our show notes for a link to our Facebook group. Now I'm going to hand it over to your host, Laura Bowder, for today's episode.
Welcome back to the Miscarriage Hope Desk Podcast. Today we have Roman Prokopchuk with us, and Roman is going to be sharing a story that we haven't heard on the podcast before. So he and his wife have experienced multiple miscarriages, and we'll get into that story, but they also have experience with foster care. So I am excited to hear more about that as well. Roman, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Of course. So I appreciate you coming on and being willing to share your story. I'd love to start at the beginning of your story as far as the miscarriages that you and your wife have experienced and what got you through that journey to a point where you were ready to take on the responsibility of foster care.
Yeah, so we've had 5 miscarriages in the last about 3.5 years. So we've spent about I would say over $100,000 out of pocket at this point. I don't even want to check what the insurance has paid on their side, but we've been doing basically embryo transfers. We had an egg retrieval to start. We went through a infertility journey. My wife has endometriosis, which makes it tougher to get pregnant. So, and yeah, we've had 5 miscarriages, 2 of which happened on back-to-back Christmases. And they actually happen into us fostering because they overlap. So us still trying and us beginning to foster. We've had foster children while we were doing, specific cycles as well in terms of IVF. So the decision there, I think each time was obviously traumatic. And from like my perspective or the male perspective, I'm originally from Ukraine. So it's an Eastern Bloc, former Soviet country. So everybody's kind of like stoic to begin with and don't necessarily show emotion, especially in something kind of traumatic. So I think from the male perspective, I just try to be kind of like strong and be there, but didn't necessarily know how I can help with my wife going through it, with her body and everything else like that. So it did, cause a strain, and we've had multiple miscarriages. So, we did a little bit of counseling. We kind of went away, just myself and my wife, and figured out, we're still trying, but maybe a route for us to create a family as well and help kids in the process would be, foster care, because we looked at adoption, straight adoption in the US and abroad, and, depleting $100,000 out of pocket. You don't necessarily have the 40, 50, 60,000 on the spot, which often are the fees to, straight adopt, which is a sad, obviously, barrier to, help kids that may need help and, have them be part of your family. But we went to an orientation. We saw that it was, something that we were interested in. It took us several months to do the home studies, the licensing, all the background checks. And at first we wanted 1 child, and, we got licensed May 31st of 2018. And then next day, June 1st, 2 boys showed up. So it was like, here, learn. And it was premised as they were at another home. It wasn't working. We were kind of like one of the last names on the list. If we weren't going to take them, they would split them up. So we thought to ourselves, they're in the system. Only thing they have is each other. Are we willing to be kind of that barrier that would cause them to be split up? And, we don't know what experience they would have when that would happen. And we said, no, so let's try it. And, that lasted for a year. That was positioned as parental rights would possibly be terminated. So we were going into it thinking that there was a possibility of adoption, and in foster care, a case can turn overnight. So we had them for a year, it moved towards reunification. They were reunified, and that hurt just as much as, the miscarriages, because I think there's a specific kind of loss. I talked to a therapist where it's like not a death, but like the person is alive, but you can never kind of have them in your life, or you can't see how they're doing in the sense.
Right.
So that's happened obviously numerous times, because since then we've had 25 children in our home, as
Wow.
up to 6 children at once. We had 5 up to a few weeks ago. Currently we have 4. So it's an emotional roller coaster as well, especially when it's set up like you're going to, be able to adopt a child, or if you see children going back into similar situations that they came from, and you don't necessarily have much of a say in the case. So there's
Right.
all these other variables to consider, and it hurts just as bad. Like I said, if you're thinking a child's going to be permanently part of your family and then they end up going home, which in that first situation, we're proud of their mother. She did everything she needed to do. They're actually well taken care of. They're bright kids. They're happy. They're healthy. So that's one of those success stories, but it didn't hurt any less in terms of, them going back, because I mean, they called us mom and dad. It was one of those things where we did things like go to Disney World with them, take them all over. And yeah, it was tough.
Yeah, I'm sure. And I feel like that is probably a big barrier to people taking on the foster care role, because you're never quite sure exactly how long they're going to stay, and you build that attachment just like you would to your own child, and then as you mentioned, very suddenly it can all change.
Yep. And certain things are kind of cues in terms of how a case is going. Usually, like the clock starts if a child is taken, there's a year from the date. So the parents have a year to do all the things that they're mandated by the family court, to do to get them back. And then there's usually reevaluations of the case at 6 months. Usually, if the parent never showed up to visits, never did anything in terms of that kind of course to get them back, usually other routes are looked at that time. So possibly moving to termination of parental rights, or looking for other family members, things of that nature. And if it is termination of parental rights, there's a meeting where they come and ask you if that did happen, are you willing and open to adoption. And that's kind of part of the process. But in terms of kind of like the cases, how we know that they're going, obviously we know things about each case, talking to the caseworker, the law guardian. There's like a million people involved in each case. But with visitation, so usually when a child is taken, they get visitation on site supervised for a few hours. Then it kind of graduates to a little bit more in terms of time, then on site unsupervised, then off site back at home, supervised, back home unsupervised, and then back home overnight. So when it reaches that overnight time, like that comfort level is there, the state, of Division of Child Services, like are comfortable in terms of it somewhat being safe and seeing how they're interacting with the children. And usually when those start, it's about 4 to 6 weeks until reunification. So that's kind of like a informal timeline we go. If we don't know a lot of the facts, we go by
Mhm.
like what that visitation looks like.
Yeah, so you do get some some hints to what might be happening with the child. um are there any children that is there I just don't know enough about foster care. Are there any situations where a child is placed with you for foster care, but you would know already that this child is definitely going to be up for adoption, or is there always kind of that year where they're trying to figure it out?
I think it's figure it out. And it's usually if one person automatically loses custody, they start going aggressively for the other person.
Hmm.
And if the other person is unfit as well as the direct guardian, so mother and father, whatever partner, whoever's the guardian, and if they have a spouse or a partner, they look at the family and then the next like close family friends if they're willing to take the child. I mean, it's state to state, the policy is different,
Sure.
but New Jersey is kind of a reunification and kinship over everything. So the new commissioner started in 2018, I believe, like a month or two after, and they wanted rates like to have kids in foster care down to like 15% or something like that. 20% of kids in the foster care system would be in foster homes, or even they call them resource homes in New Jersey. Everyone else would be with family members, close friends, that kind of thing, which is a good policy. But when it's pushed that above everything, it goes wrong because situations aren't assessed correctly. Sometimes there's like generational, drug abuse and, physical abuse that hasn't been addressed or broken, or no one went to therapy. So it's cool to keep kids with families when it's a safe and healthy situation. Sometimes that may not be the best situation in terms of the child, but that's currently kind of the policy in New Jersey, the state that I'm in.
Absolutely, yeah. And we used to see those kinds of things when I worked in public schools as a school psychologist. There's always cases where you wish that more could be done just at the governmental level or through child protective services, and there's just very high bars for what they're willing to get involved in, and then there's also a very high bar for removing a child from a home. And you can definitely argue on all sides of that about the importance of staying with a family versus the importance of that child's safety and well-being. And there are all kinds of nuances to every little case, but like you mentioned, I mean, it doesn't make it any less heartbreaking to attach yourself to a child for a year and then to watch them leave and go back. And I'm sure it's difficult for the children as well. I mean, is there any kind of like slowly weaning them off of an attachment to their foster families?
Unfortunately, no. That's one of my biggest like issues, like delivering the services that the children need, especially in that latter part, getting close to reunification.
Yeah.
So that going at home, that first home visit that's supervised, the division doesn't prepare the children for that. There's no therapeutic services that prepare them. So we have to kind of get them ready. And oftentimes they're going back to the place where something traumatic they've seen or happened to them.
Right.
So it's an automatic trigger in terms of behavioral change, which we've had, children that are maybe 4 or 5 years old, they go to that, come back, start just stay in the kitchen, start just wetting their pants and stuff like that. And just like abnormal behavior that
Mhm.
we kind of highlight that sometimes is kind of brushed under the rug. But that, and I don't think there's adequate like reunification plans in general. So therapy for the children, getting them ready, coming to terms that they've been with, the resource family and my wife and I, in our case, that, we will be there if their biological family needs us in terms of helping them out with anything. If they let us see them once in a while or hear from them, have a Skype or Zoom call.
Mhm.
But we aren't going to be there full time anymore. Not that we don't want to, but because their moms and dads and whoever else are doing better and are ready to have them come home. And there's no formal like therapeutic steps for that, or therapeutic steps for the parent or guardian, because they're going from like visitation, seeing their children for a year for like a few hours a week, to now having them 24/7. So it's a little different. Their children may be completely different little humans in terms of
Yeah.
development and what makes them tick. And then therapy, like group therapy for both the parents, guardians, and the children. So I think that's a big bottleneck I see that could be transitioned a lot smoothly. And I think the recidivism rate would be a lot lower, where it's like, kind of scared straight, where the parents get the children and don't know what to do,
Yeah.
sometimes leading to, if they're clean in terms of drug use, relapsing, or just, abandoning the situation, which has happened. So I feel like having a formal process where it's helping the parents, the children, and both of them together, I think is lacking and could really add value.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. And on your side of things, I mean, what have you and your wife been able to do just to take care of yourselves throughout these situations? You're dealing with emotional trauma from losing your own pregnancies. You're dealing with the trauma when the kids have to go back home. Like what are you doing to take care of yourselves during these times?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, definitely leaning on each other. Sometimes, obviously, at times we have up to 5, 6 children in our home, which is kind of crazy to conceive. If you asked me a few years ago, would you be taking care of one little human? I'd probably say no, but let alone six. So
Yeah. Yeah, that I feel a little bit overwhelmed just thinking about having 6 of them in my home right now, but I mean, it's such a wonderful thing that you 2 are doing. Can you walk us through a little bit of what that decision looked like for you 2? Like, where were you in your fertility process? What kind of things went through your minds when you were deciding that this was gonna be your next step?
yeah, so we at that point we already experienced 4 miscarriages. So we did one uh transfer when we had our first placement as foster parents. And it was one of those things where we knew we loved children, we knew we wanted to grow a family. And then we saw, like I said, we explored the adoption route, direct adoption, and we obviously didn't think that was the right fit. So we thought, there's a lot of kids in the foster care system, but I feel like, not to say every home is bad, but stereotypically things you see on the news or TV or the movies, a lot of it is, negative depictions of, foster parents and foster homes. So we thought we can, help as many kids in the process and possibly, like I said, being foster to adopt, um, maybe adding and growing our family that way if the opportunity arose. So it was one of those things where it was just like my wife kind of convinced me, which she usually does with things. And I just kind of like, all right, let me jump on board because I don't want to argue. And we went to an orientation session, and then, we said we were interested, and that really got the application process. And then in unison, when that case study is happening, you're doing class time. So I believe it's like 3 hours a week, one night a week for like 9 or 10 weeks. It's
Mm.
called pride training, to do kind of like the class component of it. And then you have, like I said, the case study in unison. And then when the case study is done and you kind of pass that and were approved through background checks and things of that nature, then basically your home itself has to be licensed, because you may be, you passed kind of the test, your home may still fail. So like your home may be
Mhm.
unsafe. There may be things that are issues that you need to fix. I mean, some things like, okay, they walk through your home, maybe you need a fire extinguisher. That's an easy thing. But I had someone in my pride class where the home that they were in currently, they're like, no, this doesn't work. You have to like change this structural thing of your home. And the person's like, I can't pay like 20, 30,000 to adjust this one wall, which oftentimes is kind of dumb because the biological parents don't necessarily have to adhere to the same things. You know what I mean? So like if they go back, a lot of the times 1 2 bedroom apartments for multiple kids, and the division's like, okay, you can have a bunch of kids in your own bedroom. Like we need to have a washer and dryer in our home. The biological parents don't. So there's like, I don't know, kind of double standards, I should say, in terms of
Mhm.
like what a foster parent needs in terms of a home and other things versus what the biological parent needs or has to have in order to, maintain custody or get the children back.
Yeah. Yeah. And I, I know that, um, on top of dealing with, just emotional baggage that would be expected through this experience, I'm sure that feels like kind of some undue pressure or level of criticism, just, when you're already going through something difficult.
Yeah, that, and there's good caseworkers, there's bad caseworkers, there's
Yeah.
situations where, the caseloads are high, people become desensitized, like other careers where they start seeing things and they treat cases more like numbers and not like individuals. I mean, we've had caseworkers say, it doesn't matter what you say to us or complain about us, we're never going to get fired, you're never going to get us fired, so it really doesn't matter. So
Mm.
if you have that attitude going into a case where what we're trying to do is have the kids be in a safe place, recommend things that we're seeing in terms of behaviors and what they're experiencing in our home and what they're telling us, because we spend, 24/7, we see things that arise, things they say in their sleep, things of that nature, connecting the dots. We're like the investigators that really have like the best look and spend the most time with the children. And
Hmm.
oftentimes that's like, nah, well, it doesn't matter. And I mean, I feel like when it's something on the foster parent side, it's kind of I guess devalued, but sometimes the state itself operates in a gray area where if it makes sense more to them, that works. But if I, come from the same position, it doesn't work. So I mean, there are a lot of frustrations kind of with the system. That's why I try to speak as much as possible in terms of advocating for foster care reform. My wife has spoken to a bunch of state senators about passing a bill, because New Jersey is one of the states that doesn't have a foster parent bill of rights. So more rights in terms of, say, and what we say being weighted more in cases. So things like that can, I think, really make a difference in the process.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think it takes a very special group of people to, take on that responsibility. Um, I think we think of the responsibility and the things that it takes to become parents, but I think there's an added layer to never being quite sure what's going to happen next with the child, and balancing all of those things that you were talking about. Like, do you just start providing counseling for these children on your own, and just kind of feeling out of control ultimately if they end up going back to a situation that you don't think is best for them?
Yeah, I mean, there's been situations like that where we observe, like, listen, this is this specific, like, let's say this is oppositional defiance disorder. And we specifically said, you can't place children with those conditions or being violent because at the time, we've had children with special needs
Hmm.
that have like frontal lobe syndrome and things like that. They don't distinguish kind of right or wrong that easily, so they can be easily manipulated. And we've had caseworkers say, no, no, they're fine. And then they had all these pre-existing conditions and behavioral issues, which is fine if we didn't have other children to consider in the home. So
Right.
then we have to figure it out. And my wife documents everything, so I encourage, if you're a foster parent or a new foster parent, have everything in writing, everything documented, every conversation, because she tried to advocate for months, and then the division flipped it on us because they didn't want to assume responsibility, but she had everything documented. So all these people jumped on a phone call and tried to throw her under the bus, and she just straight reading emails and text messages. And then, I mean, you can't really hide from that. So arising from that, she wrote, like, I mean, she's a good writer. She writes some of the things I do in terms of like publications and stuff, and vets it. But she wrote like a drawn out step one when we got them, what we've tried to do, how we advocated, referred back to all these emails and text messages. It was like a 4-page email she sent to 12 people. And then those 12 people, that automatically got to like 65 people at different agencies in the state, including the commissioner of the Division of Child Services. And then everybody suddenly started doing things. And but it's sad that like you can't do that to begin with, and you have to be pushed to that level. So like, I think communication and knowing that everybody wants the best interest of the child, I think, can go a long way, because oftentimes there's different agencies involved with different kind of goals, and they don't necessarily work well with each other. So even communication, like sometimes we get calls like from the dentist, like, oh, so and so has a checkup, and we're like, they were gone from our home like 8 months ago, what are you talking about? So like, just the communication in general can be improved, that can go a long way.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I totally agree. Um, what do you think, like, if we have listeners who are considering foster care, or maybe, you know, maybe this episode has put the idea in their head that this might be something that they would want to do. What are some things that you would suggest they and their partner might think about, maybe some conversations to have between the two of them to see if this is really going to be a good fit?
Yeah. So anything I said, don't let it dissuade you. One, and two, just really have an honest conversation. If you have the time, if you feel like it's the right fit. I thought I wouldn't have time, for me personally, like with that question, but up to 6 kids is a lot. And if you have a process and a schedule and like a regimented routine, it can really go a long way helping the kids too, because the kids are coming from situations that they're neglected and not fed and malnourished. So that schedule adds, like structure to their life, and actually they're more confident and secure because they know when they're going to eat next, things of that nature.
Yes.
So like that can really help with one child, multiple children, especially if you have a busy life, different businesses, different things you have going on. And
Hmm.
then I would find people in your area, maybe some of your friends that you didn't consider to tap, maybe they fostered before, or their foster parents, to really get like a real world perspective. And if you are a foster parent, or your resource parents, that's obviously a different name for it, find a support system. That's like key, because the first few months we thought we were like super lost. Caseworkers were telling us one thing, and we didn't really know our rights as foster parents, what we can advocate for, where we can go, the services we can get. And then we found a support group of foster and adoptive parents. And another thing, when you find someone that has been through a similar experience, you understand each other on a whole different level. So when there's somebody looking from outside in, they may say, it's commendable what you do, you guys are great. But when somebody's another foster parent, they know like in the trenches stuff, they know all like the blood, sweat, and tears and everything we have to go through. So having that support system is key. And my wife found a few foster moms in the area too, that they became really close. All the foster kids play with each other, they help each other out. So I think having that perspective and having that support system can really get you through the tough times in terms of some of the things you may experience with the foster care system.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that perspective because, I'm definitely someone that's looking in and saying, I mean, I'm so happy that there are people who are willing to be foster parents. Like I said, I've definitely seen all kinds of situations in my work in public schools, and sometimes wished that more children would get to experience a good foster home compared to what they're living in sometimes. Um, is there anything that you would want to share with listeners just about healing from a miscarriage experience? Like, I think there's always that feeling, like you were talking about, like one partner is always going to feel a little bit more like, I need to be more stoic and supportive, especially if another partner is a little more like emotive with what is going on with them. um, do you have any tips or suggestions just for kind of moving forward in whatever way feels right for that particular couple?
Yeah, if you're the person that's not sharing, that's kind of keeping it in, that's thinking that they're keeping it together and being strong, if
Hmm.
that's your way to grieve, you may be feeling what the person that's, from the outside showing all that emotion, you may be feeling the same exact thing or even
Yeah.
more. I would just like have a conversation and dialogue, open dialogue. I'm still grieving, I'm dealing with this. How can I help you? And it was one of those things where like I felt helpless from my perspective because I'm grieving through it, but my wife is going through it because it's her body and all these, hormonal things and all these other implications. So like being there and being available and, just being open to it and understanding that that person may be dealing with it a little differently, because obviously you can't experience certain things when, you don't necessarily carry a child. So
Yeah.
being open and, sometimes like for me, obviously it's tougher to share feelings, but really being open about it, that it is hurting me, that it is like messing me up inside, because I think if you hold it in, it'll kind of bottle or bubble over at some point. So that
Sure.
emotion will spill over into other parts of your life, or if you don't come to terms with it, it's going to implode in one way or another. So I think just having an open dialogue and communication, regardless if you're showing it outward or not, can really get you, I guess, on the same page, or at least understand
Yeah.
that, to your wife or your partner or whoever's having that emotion, that you're grieving in a different way. You're there for them and you're, experiencing the same emotion and grief, but you're handling it in a different way.
I think that's really important to communicate. I know in my experience and in the experience of other people that I've talked to, often um, women can feel like their partners aren't experiencing as much grief as they are, or they just want to move on, or they don't want to talk about it. And so I think you're exactly right to encourage that kind of conversation and dialogue, because often it's more the case that that other partner is really just trying to be supportive and trying to keep their own feelings kind of in check so they can really be there to support the other person. So I think each person kind of ends up walking on eggshells a little bit around each other when you really need each other most.
Yeah, and if you don't communicate, you start lashing out at each other and kind of moving further away and kind of isolating yourselves. Whereas, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, that's happened at least few of the miscarriages. So, I mean, like I said, having that open dialogue, I think, keeps you, close. And the fact that you're experiencing this together, you're kind of on the same team. You're not, in opposition to each other in this. So it's not necessary to be combative, or sometimes you start blaming each other, why it was maybe this, maybe that, that's why it didn't work, well it was you, like you stressed me out. And like the conversations, when people start getting defensive and then stepping back and get, dark and mean and sometimes verbally abusive. So like having that open dialogue can really avoid that additional stress and really help in the, grieving and healing process.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. Um, So if we have listeners that want to learn more about foster care, or they've connected with something else that you said today, where can they connect with you online?
Yeah, so any social channel, I'm fairly active and open. I mean, my website is novazoradigital.com, which is I'm in digital marketing. And at this point, I have 2 podcasts out there that you can find me on. So, but foster care related stuff, feel free to reach out via social. I'm more than happy to either jump on a Zoom call or answer a question. Speaking of Clubhouse, somebody sat in on a podcast, thing I was on stage.
Yeah.
They contacted me on LinkedIn and said, "Hey, I'm a foster dad. I heard you mention that." So it's always important to mention, regardless of the room, what you're passionate about, and you can really
Yeah.
connect to people that you wouldn't normally expect to connect with.
Absolutely, yes. And so all of that will be linked in our show notes. So if you want to reach out to Roman, all of that will be there. And Roman, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for joining us today, and don't forget to check out our show notes for details on joining our Facebook group and for following along on Instagram. If you would like a free recurrent pregnancy loss lab checklist, go to miscarriagehopedesk.com/labs. Again, that's miscarriagehopedesk.com/LABS to get your free downloadable checklist. And for even more resources, visit the Miscarriage Hope Desk website, where we have stories of hope plus an entire library of evidence-based research articles related to fertility and miscarriage. If you enjoyed this episode, I would so appreciate it if you rate, reviewed, and subscribed to the Miscarriage Hope Desk podcast. Your ratings and reviews will help others to find us. I want to wrap up by saying that if you are going through a miscarriage, my heart goes out to you, and as difficult as your experience may be, I want you to know that you are not alone and that you will find a path forward.